I can't help but mention the social phenomena in the field, the way in which the number of people doing machine learning has expanded so rapidly, and the wider availability of tools that make algorithms that were difficult to implement now much easier to implement. And I think that that's much more significant than any particular technical development. The accessibility of the tools and the ease of deployability with these tools and the numbers of people that are using has just made a massive difference in the field over the last 5 or 6 years. What excites me about machine learning in Africa is the potential. We're in a situation now where historically development has required infrastructure, and that's typically been physical infrastructure, roads, railways, expensive to build. Africa has massive potential because although the physical infrastructure isn't always so good, the information infrastructure is there. So in many countries, there's very good quality mobile internet. Now, what that means you can potentially do is combine information infrastructure with the physical world to try and develop in new and interesting ways. For example, health systems, if you have a very highly interconnected infrastructure, you do a health system in a different way than perhaps you would in a more developed country. That, to me, makes Africa one of the most interesting places for deploying machine learning solutions, because you end up deploying a solution that is end-to-end. It goes from perhaps the farmer's field to the Ministry of Agriculture, or from a local health center all the way to the Ministry of Health. That's very unusual in more developed countries where you're typically fitting into an existing ecosystem. And that's perhaps the most interesting thing for me about machine learning on the African continent. I think there's sort of been two areas where machine learning is affecting society. I broadly categorize them as AI and data science, and I tend to separate those because although there's a lot of relations between the two, there's something different going on. What I categorize as AI is where machine learning has enabled us to develop technologies which do things that used to be entirely the provenance of human beings, such as automated translation or image recognition of objects in images, or automatic speech recognition. Machine learning has really driven those fields forward such that we're getting performances today that were just unimaginable even sort of 7, 8 years ago. Now, that's one area where we've seen rapid development, and then you're seeing a lot of applications where people, once you have these capabilities, they're developing new applications around them, such as translation software. An area that's almost of more interest to me, but perhaps less in the headlines, is what I see as data science. So data science I view more as the challenges of the fact that we've got all these sensors, we're carrying around mobile phones, and we're laying down a lot of data by happenstance. So the data is available, and we'd like to be able to do new things with it. So we'd like to be able to understand health better or crop disease better. Now, it's not that humans can necessarily do this if there's all this data. So these are sort of new challenges, and they're substantially different from classical statistical challenges, because in classical statistics, you typically acquire the data set to answer the question. Here, the data has come before the question. Now, I think that's the area where, in the long term, I actually expect even greater potential, because it affects existing businesses. It affects things like supply chain or health, things that we've been trying to do for years. But I think it takes longer for those effects to be felt because those businesses need to change what they're doing. They need to assimilate all these new techniques. So we see rapid development in areas around AI or classical AI domains, which are typically the provenance of humans. But I think the developments we'll see in data science will be a little bit slower just because it takes time to assimilate all the techniques, but in the long term, perhaps have even a greater effect. How does an African scientist contribute in a larger industrial research organization? That's clearly a challenge. We could put the same question without. So the easiest way, unfortunately, is to move to the places where those organizations are operating. which is great for the individual, but perhaps doesn't help the ecosystem locally as much. But excitingly, we've seen Google have opened a lab in Accra, in Ghana, and I think that I hope we'll see other research institutions. Also, South Africa's also a great place to locate. Industrial research is different from academic research in that it tends to be problem-driven rather than technology-driven. Well, that's not universally true. Some of the larger internet companies are still doing a lot of technology-driven research. But what I hope will happen is that we'll see more grassroots industrial development in Africa, that because of the improved accessibility of these technologies, there'll be more companies growing in Africa, addressing African problems, and there'll be more opportunities to work for those companies. Because the aspect that an African researcher brings the most to machine learning is their domain knowledge. And that's true with any researcher. Now that the techniques are becoming more widely available, the thing that is unique, given cultural backgrounds, is the domain knowledge and how to solve the right sort of problems. That can't be done from the United States, Silicon Valley, from Cambridge in the UK. It has to be done by people with an understanding of the real problems. So long term, I hope we see a closing of the gap between where people are being employed in machine learning and where some of the most interesting problems to solve in machine learning are. It's hard to be specific, but I think the largest problems are all associated with the same challenge, which is limitations on resource, whether it's drinkable water, whether it's energy, energy of course relating to climate change. It's a limited availability of sustainable resource, which affects us all. Well, how can machine learning help? Well, definitions of intelligence are hard, but the personal definition I use is that you use information to achieve goals with less resource than you would have done had you not had that information. For me, that's an intelligent decision. So if I can use information to achieve my end goal using less resource than I would have done without that information, that's an intelligent decision. And the less resource I use, the more intelligent the decision is. So my hope is, and we're perhaps a long way from being able to realize it, but in the long term we can use machine learning and other techniques, all the information infrastructures we have, to reduce the amount of resource we all individually need to have the lives that we seek. That would hopefully lead to a more sustainable future and put less pressure on those precious resources we have.